I worry that these 2 years he's spent in a strange COVID isolation have done something odd to his head, and that he is now the geopolitical equivalent of someone who spends too much time on Facebook reading conspiracy theories. Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, has decided to recognize 2 bits of eastern Ukraine that he hived off 8 years ago as independent states.
I consider it necessary to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics.
Putin is a kleptocrat. The people around him are kleptocrats. They have stolen more stuff than the bottom 99.8% of Russians. It is a staggeringly unequal society. Democracy is a threat to that wealth. It is a threat to their social position.
Invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula.
8 years ago, Putin invaded Ukraine. The reason why he's continued to violate Ukraine's sovereignty for 8 years is because the Ukrainians consistently refuse to get the message that they should do what they're told. If our support for democracy on this side of the continent means anything, we need to continue to support Ukrainians' attempt to be free. Ukraine is a big country. This isn't like Georgia in 2008. Ukraine has a population of 40-odd million. Many of them are determined to resist Russian intervention, just like their forefathers resisted Soviet intervention during and after the Second World War. So it's a potentially very alarming situation.
Earlier, this. Russian TV claimed Ukraine was shelling the rebel republics. Fake news, Kiev says, and Moscow inventing a pretext for military intervention.
I don't think this time that his disinformation game has been successful. Get to call BS on what Putin has been doing, which Putin has really struggled to respond to. So it's too early to say if the Russian propaganda is working. It's also, to be honest, very hard to judge how propaganda lands within Russia. There does seem to be a real disconnect between the Ukrainians' perception of the last 8 years and Russians' perception of the last 8 years. And I think a lot of that is down to the diet that Russians have been fed from Russian state media, which has been, very, well, one-sided is a kind way of putting it. So far, I think Western countries have been unified, but again, we haven't heard from Viktor Orban in Hungary, or we haven't seen what the internal debates are in the European Council. It was certainly very difficult to agree unified action in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, and I don't really see why it would be any different this time. This is supposed to be a continent, Europe, that is past this kind of behaviour. We're supposed to have learnt a lesson in 1945 that this kind of thing wasn't acceptable. So we need to make sure that we respond to it adequately, and obviously we're not going to go to war with Russia. That would be World War III, and no one wants that. But there are a lot of things short of war in order to make sure that Putin and his friends realise that this is unacceptable.
Now the UK and our allies will begin to impose the sanctions on Russia that we have already prepared.
Sanctions are important, but I worry that sanctions have become the sole tool being used to put pressure on kleptocrats. I appreciate this is a daft analogy, but I don't know if you've seen the Mandalorian on Disney+, but he has a button on the dashboard of his spaceship that if he needs to get out of trouble, he can press that button and he suddenly moves extremely quickly. The way the government, certainly in the UK and in the EU, the way they're using sanctions is a bit like sticking that button on the dashboard of an old banger, a Robin Reliant or something, and expecting it to get them out of trouble. It only works if you're dealing with an already finely tuned, well-fueled spaceship. You can't sanction someone if you don't know what they own, and you can't sanction wealth if you don't know who owns it. So sanctions aren't enough. We need to give law enforcement the tools they need to take on oligarchs. And there's this astonishing quote in the Intelligence and Security Committee's Russian report, which was published almost 2 years ago, from the director of the National Crime Agency, saying that when it comes to tackling oligarchs, she said, we are frankly worried about our budget. We're dealing with I think she said, a relatively limited resource envelope, which if you cut through the jargon means that the National Crime Agency doesn't have the cash to take on oligarchs. Well, that's absurd. You know, oligarchs aren't that rich. You know, we are a G7 economy. We can afford to take them on if we want to, but we have chosen not to do so.
We will not give up. We will continue to seek a diplomatic solution until the last possible moment.
So I'm very much hoping that we see in Parliament today, next week and the week after, MPs both on his benches and opposition benches really stand up and demand, finally, well-resourced, coherent action against the kleptocratic cash that has been coming into this country for decades, because it is never going to be easier to tackle it than it is now. We need to treat the circle around Putin as the mafiosi that they are. It is not enough to drive out mafiosi when they have launched a killing spree against their neighbours. They are criminals, not politicians. I find it difficult to assess how Putin will respond to what Britain and other Western countries do now, because I do not believe he is acting rationally, and that is an alarming situation to be in.